Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, comment, and subscribe for more, and follow my social medias in the description below. I'll see you next time. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the stream. I haven't been live in a while. It's good to see everyone. I'm here with a special guest today from Understanding Russian Christianity. I'm going to bring him up right now. Igor, how are you, my friend?
Hey, how are you? Hey, well, greetings
Good,
from
good.
Finland, from Helsinki.
Yes. So today the conversation is going to be about Orthodox Christianity under the Soviet Union. I don't think I'm going to be doing a whole lot of talking. Igor is here to kind of, give his expertise. As if some of you guys are familiar maybe with Igor's channel, maybe you're not. I have all the links in the description to his channel and also to his book, which is on Amazon, which I actually bought a copy of, and I think it's coming tomorrow on Sunday. The book is called Understanding Russian Christianity, and you can find a link to that, Amazon link to that in the description. So I'm just going to let Igor here introduce himself here, kind of let him speak for himself.
Yeah, so in brief, Igor Mikeshin, that's the second name. I now live in Finland, but I'm originally from St. Petersburg, Russia, where I grew up, where I was born in Leningrad, Soviet Union. And so it's a long path from my birth to the creation of the YouTube channel. I am a researcher at the university. I study Christianity in Russia. So I have my narrow specialization, which is evangelical Christianity. And commonly I work on a project on Jehovah's Witnesses that are fleeing from persecution in Russia to Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and other places. And Russian Christianity in general, Christianity in Russia and Russian Christianity is like my more general topic. This is something I teach on the course, and it's something I write on, and something that I do for YouTube. And are you interested in the idea of the YouTube channel? Because it's a very short story, but I think it's super relevant. Because I was not doing YouTube forever. I started doing YouTube maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It was a different channel, it was in Russian. I was interviewing people who do research on Christianity in Russia, various projects, various communities, various interesting aspects from different disciplines. It was in Russian. It was a small, quite marginal channel, still exists, but I stopped working on it. And then the war started. The war, the active, because some count the war from 2014, but let's say the active military invasion into Ukraine started in 2022. And there was a big shock, and everyone was dumbfounded and outraged and everything. And I couldn't continue that channel with with experts on Russian Christianity for certain reasons, ethical and personal. And I decided that I should say a word from my point of view, from what I know, from what I do for a living, somehow contribute to understanding at least what's going on. And that's how the idea of the channel came about. So I started it with videos like on the role of the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church in the war, and what's going on, and why is it not that simple, why it's not just what the patriarch says, and so on and so forth. So it's a long story. I try to make it short. That just to clarify why I'm here, why am I a YouTuber talking about Russian Christianity?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, he has a lot of topics on various interesting things pertaining to Russian Christianity. I think recently you just did one on I watched like a little bit of it. I just saw the thumbnail, whether all the Bolsheviks, I believe, were ethnically Jewish, I think, or religiously Jewish.
There was a part of the last video. It's just called, "Is it all Jews?" Because what's going on nowadays, especially online, people just make the world look very simple. It's all Jews' fault.
Yeah.
And Jews control the world, and something of that matter. I'm not an expert on Jewish issues like worldwide in all of the history, but I made my contribution from the standpoint of Russia, because people keep claiming that all Bolsheviks were Jewish, or like the leaders were Jewish. It's not exactly accurate.
That's a very common claim. I mean, especially in Orthodox circles, and I think maybe I'm sort of in the Anglo-Orthodox sphere, so I'm assuming it's a lot of converts coming in, and when they come in with a lot of this sort of baggage, maybe political baggage, and you see this to where it just like it becomes this weird obsession with Jews, and I'm like, why don't you just focus on being an Orthodox Christian and just, all right, like I get it, there's certain spaces that, right, it's clear that something is going on, but like, yeah, and that's a very common claim. I actually made it like a short reel of persecution under like the early 1930s persecution, and I took some old footage and I just put it together, and it was like a beautiful video with an Orthodox chant in the back in Russian, and all the comments are like, Jews, 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 Jews. Like they're
But
all
Jews were on both sides. They were
Yeah.
the ones who persecuted and the ones persecuted. So
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
obviously they were.
Yeah, that's the thing about history is people think it's like very simple, like you just said. But in reality, like it's much more complex than that. It's not just like these guys were Jews, these guys were these guys. It's like it's not that simple. History is never that simple. Okay, so yeah, so today we wanted to just get into just kind of the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, hitting on the timeline some like major events that occurred, and I wanted to start with the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Bolshevik Revolution starts in 1917. Tsar Nicholas II abdicates, and then I think 1918, or maybe if you want to talk about 1917, but 1918 is kind of the Russian Orthodox Church is officially separated from the state. So like a lot starts to happen there. So if you just want to start there, Igor, at the revolution and what the state of the Russian Orthodox Church is and what the state of Russian Orthodox Christians is at that time.
So yeah, again, it's of course much complicated, so we cannot cover it in this time. But just to say a couple of words that the history of the Russian Orthodox Church in the 20th century does not exactly coincide with the Bolshevik Revolution. It goes a little bit back, the same year, 1917, when they elected the first patriarch in 200 years, if I count correctly. So the start of the second patriarchal period, so-called, in the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, because Peter the Great abolished the position of the patriarch, and he basically made the church a state department. So, and it was even headed by a secular official, not by a priest, not by a bishop, but by a secular officer. So they ended it because 1917 was a year with a series of revolutions. For instance, the Tsar Nicholas II abdicated before the last decisive revolution of Bolsheviks. He already was not in power. It was a temporary government, consisted of different interesting political figures. So you see, it's all it's like a curveball of events.
Mhm.
So by the time Bolsheviks came to power, Tsar already abdicated, and the Russian Orthodox Church had the first patriarch in 200 years, Patriarch Tikhon. And of course, that the act of the secularization, it came a little bit later, in the beginning of 1918, simply because there was too many things to deal with. So, but eventually, as soon as possible, they separated the state from the church and education from the church. But it was also a big deal. It was not just that we now are not formally a Christian country. We now formally a secular country, or even more anti-religious atheist country. The church was much more than just a religious organization. It was basically registration of births, deaths, marriages, and an integral part of education, and so on and so forth. So it was basically a very painful process of separating all that. So you had to recreate education, recreate the state registration of all these things: births, deaths, marriages, and much more than that. So, and also culture, history. So yeah, it was a big deal, to say the least.
Mhm. Yeah, in 1918, can you just talk a little bit about? I know there was like a big mass closures and execution of clergy and property seizure, right? Pretty much right after the revolution, right, in 1918.
Yeah, it came in waves because, for
Mhm.
instance, the Bolshevik propaganda saw the church as the ally of the imperial regime. So basically, a support of the imperial regime. And in the Marxist ideology, they also found for them the niche that religion is the opium for the masses, and they support the capitalist, the class that owns the means of production, and basically the people who don't own the means of production, the proletariat, they are being discriminated upon and exploited. So the church provided ideological support for this exploitation, and this was the narrative. And the persecution, it came in waves because, for instance, the Orthodox Church was the main enemy in the very early days of the Soviet state, but other Christian churches and denominations and groups and other religions were not so much. They even were seen as temporary allies. For instance, evangelical Christians, they were considered not exactly communists and socialists, but in a way allies that are against the centralization, the hierarchy, the capitalist, this imperialist church. But that ended soon, obviously, but there were temporary periods. And even this antagonism with the church was in different stages. Sometimes there were public debates, like Lunacharsky, a minister for education, not education, for enlightenment. I don't remember the exact name for his position. He was an active anti-religious propagandist, and they had these debates, public debates, with where they could make a case for religion, anti-religion. So it was not always just bland destruction and execution. But
Mm.
we should also bear in mind that from 1918 roughly to 1921 there was a civil war, and during the civil war, large portions of Russia, they changed control. So whites had them, then the reds had them, then the greens had them, and different changes of regimes. And obviously there was no law, and there was a martial law, and there was all sorts of anarchy, and people were suffering from that, left and right, all groups, all social layers. And the clergy suffered, of course, and religious people suffered from the reds, who were already from the scratch anti-religious because they were Marxist. And yeah, that there was persecution during the civil war. Obviously, they suffered the most from the reds.
Yeah, and so that was pretty much how the Bolsheviks justified the persecution of the church. Essentially, it was because they were part of this sort of imperialist Russia of the past. That was kind of the theme.
Yeah, it was both. It was basically the Marxist ideology, but applied to the Russian context. So
Okay.
yeah, they were the ideological support for the imperialist regime, and they were
Mhm.
the class that exploited the proletariat and helped provided ideological support for that exploitation. So one of the main things, apart from separating them from the church and education, from the state and education, was also to abolish any property owned by church. So the church could not own any property, neither buildings nor anything else. And
Yeah.
hence the state could take the building at any point and make it a vegetable storage, for instance, and store potatoes there or something like that, which was also symbolic. It was a message. It's not just they were out of storages for vegetables. This was exactly the message. That's how we value your cult buildings.
Hmm. Okay, gotcha. And can you talk a little bit about? I know in 1922, Patriarch Nihon is arrested, or Tikhon, sorry, Patriarch
Tikhon, yeah.
Tikhon is arrested, and the state launches, I think, what they call like a Renovationist schism, so sort of like
Mhm.
a Soviet-backed pseudo-Orthodox group. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was one of the tragic times. They tried to split the church into fractions, and even more than just two fractions, but that was the start of it. They tried to split the church, so they encouraged certain priests and bishops with total reformation of the whole church, renovation, and obedience to the state, obviously, and married bishops who shaved their beards also totally, which looked quite unusual. And still, you see the pictures; they're totally shaven and conducting a liturgy, which looks very weird in the Orthodox context. And that was a Bolshevik project, and it lasted for some time, but the state was not also consistent in supporting this particular movement, because this movement also split in fractions, and some fractions were more supported than others, but then they were persecuted, these fractions and that fractions. And eventually, when Stalin came to power, they just stopped discriminating and distinguishing, and they just basically oppressed all religious groups altogether, whether they were innovationists, whether they were anti-renovationists, whether they belonged to one fraction or another, and whether they belonged to one denomination or another, or one religion or another. They just stopped making any distinction by the 1930s. But eventually, yes, that was a project. It was a kind of a red church, and they tried to infiltrate it and cause disturbance, cause schism, and also they tried to involve the Russian Orthodox Church abroad in all these intrigues and behind the scene scandals. So eventually, they just decided it's just easier to try to get rid of all religion altogether by the 1930s.
Yeah, and Stalin is an interesting figure because he's so unlike all the other Bolsheviks, like ideological and everything. And we'll touch on him when I was going to ask you some things about him when we
Mhm.
continue on, because Stalin, like the other Bolsheviks, with all the things, like they were very, and they were intellectuals. The other Bolshevik intellectuals, they really believed in these ideologies. And to me, when I read history, Stalin was not like them at all. As a matter of fact, they didn't want Stalin in power at all. I know Lenin
Yeah,
didn't want Stalin
Lenin
at all.
didn't trust
Yeah,
Stalin. He even
y-
wrote records in his diary that he's
yeah,
against
yeah. It
Stalin.
was like in a sense to where maybe it's because Stalin wasn't really an intellectual. He was sort of grew up as a criminal, and he wasn't in these circles. But he's an interesting figure. But and then in like around 1925, right? Patriarch Tikhon dies, and the Soviet Union
Yeah.
refuses to allow a new patriarch. Was there a reason for that, or they're just trying to like, absolve the Orthodox Church?
So we don't have. We practically can guess what was really going on behind the
Mhm.
scenes. So, and most of the leading bishops were more or less either in prison or somehow maybe retired, or were forced to the total obedience to the state, and their activity was very limited. So there was no one to choose from, basically, because and there was a placeholder who was also periodically put behind bars or in exile, and eventually the placeholder became Sergius, who served as a placeholder until his election as a patriarch in 1943, so a little less than 20 years. And yeah, that was a very turbulent time, and with lots of...
Can you touch on so Metropolitan Sergius? He issues his controversial declaration of loyalty to the Soviet regime in like the late 1920s. Essentially, maybe the intentions were good, like he's trying to save the church, but he also seems to be alienating many of the believers by aligning with what the church considered to be the state enemies at that time. So can you talk about Metropolitan Sergius? And
yeah, he also sided with the Renovationists at some point, and there are pictures where he's sitting with them, and then he publicly repented from that when the Renovationist movement was already going down, and many important priests and bishops repented publicly to the church against this, like repenting for their participation or some sort of support of Renovationist movement. But basically, just in very general terms, the church was put before the dilemma: either you obey to the state, which is not just secular, but also atheistic and anti-religious in nature, and wants to eventually destroy the church, at least aims to that, or they are persecuted and are not free to worship and are put on the ground and put behind bars. So basically all the priests and bishops were constantly trying to negotiate in this situation, to trying to balance out how they practice, how they worship, and how they conduct their church. And Sergius, Sergei, was also constantly put under this pressure, and he also had ambition to power, because being a placeholder for the patriarch who deceased in 1925, he also tried to balance between that, and eventually he chose the way to obedience to the state power, and issued the declaration. I have it somewhere written down. So he issued a declaration which basically was a call for obedience to the state, for patriotism, and for rejection of the Orthodox Church abroad.
Okay.
Yeah. So he issued a proclamation to all bishops, to all priests, and all the faithful of the church. And he signed this proclamation as a deputy to Metropolitan Piotr Polyansky, who still was the placeholder of the patriarch. And they called the clergy and the faithful to obedience to the state and to compliance with the state ideology. And although they still mentioned in the proclamation that the Soviet state was atheistic, but the Orthodox Christians were called to be good, compliant citizens. And even they called for this Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia to recognize the Soviet state and to commemorate the leadership of the Soviet state in the liturgies, so to be loyal to it. So this basically led to a new split, and the Sergian, how is it called now? Sergian, what's the word I'm looking for?
I know what you're talking about, but I don't recall what they call it.
Heresy, and eventually that put under question even his own patriarchy. When Sergius became the patriarch eventually in 1943, this led to the big number of the faithful to question his legitimacy. There were other circumstances that made them question his legitimacy, because there was just a dozen of bishops, surviving bishops, who elected him as a patriarch. That was another issue. So there were lots of problems with his patriarchy, which didn't last that long. He died in a year later, but still, So the Sergian, let's say it's schism, there is still a term in the Russian Orthodox Church. There are many people who believe that he was illegitimate and a heretic.
Yeah, that's pretty much kind of the view in Orthodoxy, that he is a legitimate and a heretic, and he aligned with the enemies. Ed, thank you for the 4.99. It looks like we have a fan here from your channel. The Orthodox Perspective says, I can't say I never had problems with the guy's views or approach to Orthodox Christianity. He may remember me on his comment sections. I don't know if you remember this guy.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't remember you from the comment section. Sorry for that. Maybe there are too many, but of course, I have many people who disagreed with me and many people who called me out. And the main reason for that is that I don't myself identify with Orthodox Christianity. I am not an Orthodox Christian. So the main criticism was, how dare you talk about our faith? And another criticism was that when I talk about something that is, let's say, negative about the church, to which I usually respond the same. So first, I don't discuss faith. I don't discuss which faith is right, who is right in their faith, whose theology is right, and so on and so forth, because I'm a social scientist. That's not what I study. Of course, I talk about it a lot because it's relevant, but my major interest is people and groups of people. As a social scientist, I study how people live, how they do what they do, why they believe what they believe, how they justify it. And I'm in no position to judge whether they're right or wrong. And the second part is when I talk about negative stuff. Negative stuff exists. Sorry about that. And there is a lot of stuff that is very unflattering to the Orthodox Church in Russia. And at the same point, I have a tremendous respect to the Russian Orthodox Church. I have many friends who are genuine Orthodox believers, but we should also, when we discuss the church, we should remember that the church is much more than just, like, let's say, the patriarch, key bishops, some priests, and some believers. It's a tremendously complex, I may even say, as a social scientist, it's an umbrella. Under this umbrella, you can find so many different things loosely connected to each other. Of course, they have formal connection. There is a formal hierarchy, but at the same time, there are millions of people under this umbrella, and there are thousands of years, more than 1,000, not thousands, but 1,000+ years, if we just count the Orthodox Church in Russia, because if we count the whole, the universal church, that would be more than 1,000 years. Significantly more. Yeah. So even if we count from the Christianization of Rus, which is roughly year 998, it's still more than 1,000 years, and it's millions of people. So we cannot just say that we cannot grasp the church in a nutshell, because that would be something like scratching the surface, but not the whole issue. So that is why I talk about all things that I respect, that I don't agree with, maybe, and scandals. Sometimes I talk about scandals, and I don't know. I have no insider access, like the gay scandals in the Russian Orthodox Church. There was a very controversial video, and people keep saying to me, "How dare you? How dare you accusing, accusing the church and her bishops?" I said, I don't know. I haven't been there. Maybe it's all lies, but this is what I know. This is where I know it from. And this is what people exactly say. So it's an important topic because there was a great scandal, and it considered certain groups within the church more than, concerned certain groups within the church more than others. So it's kind of a systemic issue if it exists. So it's mostly about bishops or monastic priests, and not so much about married priests or the lay people. Interesting. Why is that so? Maybe there is some systemic issue or problem, and this is what I wanted to talk about in that particular video. So yeah, that's kind of a long response to possible criticisms. And of course, you don't have to agree with me, because I make mistakes and my scope is always limited.
Yeah, there tends to be a lot of criticism anytime somebody points out the negatives in certain jurisdictions. But I mean, I see Orthodox Christians, criticizing the EP and sometimes I'll go on rants criticizing the MP. And
Mm.
yeah, maybe as a layman, from an Orthodox perspective, maybe I should just, be quiet and shut up. But, sometimes these things are happening. And at the end of the day, like I always like to say that Orthodoxy isn't like Roman Catholicism, right? There isn't the Pope isn't essentially the Pope isn't really the church. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but right, it's this one representative of we don't have that. We have these various bishops, we have various jurisdictions. I mean, I'm not even under the Moscow Patriarch. I'm under a different patriarch. But so it's like, what is he going to do? Excommunicate me? But anyways, um, I see. Speaking of the Renovationist church, I see people in the comments already comparing it to the schismatic church, which I consider them as schismatic. But as we know, certain jurisdictions like the EP recognize the OUC, and then a few other, I believe, the Romanians and
Mm.
somebody else. Maybe the Bulgarians recognize them. I don't. I guess the connection they're trying to make is saying that they're both state made here. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that. I don't really want to get into
This is such a huge topic, the churches in Ukraine, because I can count, if we don't count Greco-Catholics, obviously, although they look Orthodox, but they are not Orthodox, they used to be several centuries ago. If we don't consider them, and we don't consider all other churches, because Ukraine is way more diverse than Russia in terms of Christian churches. It's much more religiously diverse, and the number of religious people there in proportion is way higher than in Russia. But even if we talk about Orthodox Christianity, so I can count 3 or 4 maybe churches nowadays with different claims to canonicity. And if we just don't go there, because it's a rabbit hole, obviously, if we don't go there, we can just conclude that the canon law is a hard topic, because at least 2 of them refer to the canon law, and the canon law is apparently it's similar to the civil law. It's civic law. It's open to interpretations by people who have political ambitions, and both like big players, the Moscow Patriarchate, ex-Moscow Patriarchate Church, they don't claim Moscow Patriarchate anymore, and the Church of the Constantinople Patriarchate, they both refer to the canonicity of their position. They both refer to the higher authority, and they both refer to their canon law. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and unfortunately, it's the time of war when people die left and right. And unfortunately, it's not just that interesting and amusing to watch. It's actually also pretty tragic.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to get into the canonicity of it, but it is more complicated than people think it is, and I've dug through these rabbit holes a bunch. But I mean, like, I'll just say one thing. Like, people talk about, it being illegitimate from an ecclesiastical perspective, to where, the EP just sort of absolved these schismatic bishops of their schisms. He absolved them and just sort of gave them legitimacy. But at the end of the day, like, the EP gave a bunch of people autocephaly, right? They gave all these small Slavic nations autocephaly because Constantinople was declining as an empire. Like, it was becoming weak. It gave Russia autocephaly. It gave, right, like Bulgaria autocephaly. It gives, right, Romania autocephaly. These are tiny nations. And the issue with, right, whether this church is legitimate, it's like, it's more complicated than that. And the other thing is, even if they were to do it like canonically and rebaptize all these bishops, which by the way, they offered these schismatic bishops, hey, let's rebaptize us legitimately then, and then we can, by canon law, acknowledge us as not schismatics. Like, Russia would never agree to that. Nobody would have agreed to that anyways. And the other thing is also the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was, they under the MP, right? But they were sort of functionally independent anyways. So it was it's kind of a political issue. Emotions are high. There's a war. The Ukrainians want nothing to do with the Russians. They don't even want, right, on the Ukraine, or they don't even want the MP, to even in any way be associated with them. So it's a complex issue. And then people like to make it very simple because there's a lot of politics involved in it. But it's not as simple as that. I don't want to get
Unfortunately, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Unfortunately, it's became very political, very politicized, which it was kind of doomed to become because all this history ended up with national churches, which is interesting. The Ukrainian church, the Russian church, the Romanian church, the Bulgarian church. Somehow the church is linked to the nation, to the state. And of course, it became a problem when the state have bad relationships. And even the history of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that used to be of MP, Moscow Patriarchate, even the history, it just goes back to the 1990 when Filaret, now a patriarch of the unrecognized, yet another Kievan Patriarchate, unrecognized pretty much by anyone nowadays, right? He used to be recognized by some, but nowadays he's all alone with his church. Yes, although it's quite significant, both his church and he himself. So he founded basically this Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He developed it from just a mere local metropolia of the Russian Church to something more or less independent, very like Ukrainian church after all. It's one of the claims I made in one of the videos where I discussed all these things. So you can say whatever you want about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that used to be of Moscow Patriarchate, but it is a Ukrainian church. It's not a Russian church.
Yeah. And Filaret is an interesting figure. He's kind of a suspect, sketchy figure as well. And we'll talk on him as we get there to that timeline. But going back to Orthodoxy under the Soviet Union, I wanted to, sort of you touch on the height of the persecution, which I think was somewhere between like 1928 and 1940, maybe, to where thousands of clergy are sent to the gulags.
I would say 37, 38, just like anybody else, because the direction of that persecution, the aim was not a particular group, religion even, or political. It was basically anyone who stood out, the Great Terror, the years of Great Terror, basically any individual or group that somehow stood out and did not comply, or even sometimes they were just random. There were plans, as you know, there were plans that you have to execute this amount of people, and just they were grabbing people randomly. There were stories when they knocked the door and the person didn't answer, so they knocked the other door and grabbed another person. So you see, it was not exactly directed at this particular religious group within this particular church. No, it was just total, pretty much total. It was a genocide of their own people. And the Orthodox Church had it worse because they even had the baggage from the previous years and this ideological baggage as the support for the old regime. And we ended up with practically total destruction of the church leadership. And all the leadership of all religious groups, for that matter. But the Russian Orthodox Church suffered heavily. Bishops ended up in the gulags, if not executed. And there were many. There is a list of church people, clergymen, and monks and nuns and laymen who were executed during those years. And there was how do we call it? A martyrdom or martyr? A list of martyrs. Yeah, new martyrdom. Is it a corpus of names?
Is that what it's called? The new martyr? I know what you're talking about.
I think so. In Russian, at least it is. So there is a whole bunch of martyrs who suffered for their faith. Most of them were executed for belonging to this religious group. So basically, they suffered for their faith. We can say, and like one of the notable figures, for instance, was Metropolitan Seraphim, who was already very old and almost like he would be dead in a year or two anyways from the old age. But since he was an imperial military officer, and since he was a very important bishop back in his day, and he promoted the Seraphim of Sarov, his works and his legacy and he, I think, was instrumental in the beatification of Sarov. I'm not sure if the right term in English, so like making him a saint.
Yeah, sainthood. Yeah.
Sainthood, yeah. So he was quite instrumental in many things. So he was executed at the Butovo field next to Moscow. Was a very infamous field where thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people were executed, and they were executed like a conveyor in big numbers every day almost. So he was one of those. And when he was escorted, being detained first, he could not even walk. So he was put on a stretcher, brought to the trial, and the trial was Troika trial, if you know, like just three government officials were deciding your fate in 20 minutes, like signing paper to be shot, and he was shot in a couple of days. So like figures like that. That was the Great Terror, and the Russian Orthodox Church has a long list of martyrs that suffered during this Great Terror.
Yeah, this was under Stalin's Great Purge, and I mean, I think pretty much all remaining bishops were executed, and I know it wasn't like a specific attack on the Orthodox Church, but obviously the Orthodox Church suffered probably the worst. I know my great grandfather who stayed in these these he was in a war camp in Kazakhstan. He stayed with all kinds of people, right? There was Catholic. He stayed there with Eastern Catholics, with Orthodox, with Protestants of different evangelical sects. There, it was sort of diversity, and when you're staying in these work camps, they kind of I guess these work camps were kind of sort of ecumenist from an Orthodox perspective. People just they united on the fact that we're being persecuted for following Christ. So just to let people know that. And how close was sort of the destruction of the Russian Orthodox Church during this time? Because I know it was pretty much on the brink of destruction during this Great Purge.
Yeah, you see, it's again, what do we consider a church?
Yeah,
if we consider a church, what political scientists or some sociologists or even some of my colleagues consider a church, which is the people that we know of, the people like we can Google, the leadership, the bishops, or maybe some priests, or maybe most of the priests. Then, of course, the church as an organization, as a social institution, as something like that, that was close to destruction. Yeah, it was almost evaporated. But the church is much more than that, as we all know. The church is also the faithful. The church is believers who some have formal connections with the church through sacraments, through some I don't know, state registered association. Maybe they worked for the church. Maybe they have supported it, donated, or were employed, or had some formal relationships, or had their formal positions in a clergy, or being a nun or a monk. But some just the faithful, they have no formal state registered connection to the church, but they are a part of the church through sacraments and through their even identity, their identification. So if we consider that a church, it was not it was suffering. It was decapitated, we can say. All the leadership was practically destroyed, but the church still lived, and it still existed, and it was unrealistic probably to destroy it totally, which Stalin soon realized by the 1943. Stalin, I mean, the Stalin's government, I don't know about him personally, but the regime soon realized that it's actually the case. The church still lives, and it probably is not going anywhere.
Yeah, and during this Great Purge, can you talk about how were Orthodox believers sort of able to maintain their faith under these brutal conditions, and were there any sort of underground Orthodox networks or maybe catacomb churches during this time?
There were catacomb churches, obviously, and then underground churches, but they were practically most of them, they were split from the Russian Orthodox Church. During all these turbulent times of schisms and the Sergius declaration and all this, the church leadership trying to find their way in between persecution, and total obedience to the atheistic state. So many different groups split from the church. Then there was the so-called true Orthodox Church, and there was the catacomb church of all sorts. And these are, again, umbrella terms, to say nothing about the schism of the 17th century when they were all believers. So there were many throughout the history of the Orthodox Church. There were always groups that split, and some split and became evangelical Protestants, or something in between Orthodox and evangelical Protestants, like Molokane or Khlisti, and any other sectarian, they say, groups, if we use sectarian in a neutral sense. So there were lots of them, and they were different. They were all different. I have a great friend and colleague who is doing historical anthropology, and she studies the KGB documents, and she did a big chunk of research in Ukraine in between Corona and war, and before that, when the KGB archives were open. And there was a brief period of time, and she managed to do a lot of work in Kievan archive, in Odessa, and many other places. Her name is Tatiana Vagravenko, and I think she's published a lot on this issue. And she showed us that even with pictures from criminal cases run by not even KGB, it was even before KGB, it was MGB, or even NKVD, which was even before. So it changed name, the secret police of the Soviet Union changed names. And all these pictures show us how differently they practiced and worshipped. So they had common motifs. So they were, their churches, for instance, looked like an Orthodox church. There were icons, there were crosses, there was an altar. But for instance, some groups, when they were arrested, categorically refused to be photographed. So they closed their eyes. They tried to, move away from being pictured, and everything. For them, it was something very, very important, something totally unacceptable. So at the very least, they closed their eyes. So they didn't want their eyes to be photographed. So they were obviously forced by the KGB officers to be photographed, but the photos of all of poor quality, where they in the middle of movement or with eyes closed or something like that. And some others were treating it differently. And so my main point is that there was no one catacomb church or one true Orthodox church, or one like some underground church, like one ecclesiastical body. It's an umbrella term for many different groups who may not have even contact with each other or fellowship with each other, who may not even recognize each other or be aware of each other, for that matter.
Yeah. There was I know there was a ton. The ones that you spoke of, the one that like a mixture of evangelicalism and orthodoxy, that's an interesting one that I haven't dug too much into, but my brother-in-law sent me like a documentary of it. I haven't even watched it, but that's an interesting one. But yeah, there was, and also because of this, during this time, I know, like, for example, the Pentecostal movement, for example, from America comes into the the Soviet Union, and it kind of, because of all the persecution and stuff, it becomes ripe, right? It's ripe for this movement and conversions, and then people, it's all these various groups, catacomb groups, underground churches that aren't really in communion with each other at all. And even looking at like the landscape today, I think even to this day, a lot of these underground churches, they still exist, these communities, by the way. Even here in the United States, I encounter people and I'm like shocked, like, oh wow, you're from this old weird community somewhere in Russia, and they even today, like, they don't even have communion with each other. Like there's unregistered churches, registered churches, like it's just this whole нерегистрированные, it's like this whole, like, so many underground churches came from from this great purge. So it's very interesting.
You are aware about all believers, right? So all believers do that since the 17th century. And again, the all believers is just an umbrella. There are all sorts of groups. Some of them have priests, some of them they don't have priests, like priestly and whatever, they're non-priestly, and for an important theological reason, but still. And some recognize each other, some don't. And even
Yeah.
even in the modern Russia, for us, like the official state religious narrative recognizes one of the churches with the biggest, obviously, number of faithful, and this church is headed by Metropolitan Cornelius, and Cornelius is a big supporter of Putin's war,
Mhm.
which is interesting. But
Yeah.
that's just one group of old believers, although it's the biggest one in Russia, but still it's just one of them. And but the state narrative can claim that all believers support us.
Mhm.
That's the interesting
Yeah.
thing. That's what they
Yeah.
do. The same with Pentecostals that you mentioned. One of the Pentecostal leaders supports Putin with his war,
Mhm.
and they say Pentecostals are for us. Although there are different Pentecostals,
Yeah.
and obviously it's not the case.
Yeah, it's very decentralized. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I
Mhm.
actually live near an old believer community here.
Mm.
They came here from they migrated here from Turkey in like the 1940s. So I've had
Mm.
many interactions with them. Yeah, they have the non-priestly people, the priestly people, and they have some that are in communion with the Moscow Patriarch. Usually, they sort of get shunned by that community here if they join
Mm.
ROCOR, because some of them are in communion with ROCOR. So yeah, very familiar with the Old Believer. Interesting group. I do love the Old Believer. Their liturgies are like 4 hours long, way too long. But
Mm.
they're here, yeah. So they're here in the United States. So an interesting group that, yeah, split in the over the Tikhon sort of
They
what do you
split over
call it?
Nikon in the 17th
Yeah,
century.
Nikon's, oh, yeah, over his,
Church
right, over,
reforms of the
yeah, exactly, those reforms
mid
and
17th century.
yeah, to sort of Russia wanted to become, more like the Greeks or more like mainstream Orthodoxy. They didn't really want to. Even to this day, I mean, they do so many things differently. I mean, they chant everything in the liturgy. That's why it's so long, and they have all these things that we tend to is cut out of our mainstream liturgy. They cross themselves differently. Interesting. That's a whole other
Fingers.
conversation. Yeah, exactly. That's a whole
Mhm.
other interesting conversation.
And with evangelicals that you mentioned, just don't even get me started. That's my PhD thesis. And yeah,
Okay.
I'll just mention they appeared in 1860s. So that's how long they are in Russia, and they suffered greatly throughout the
Yeah.
imperial persecutions from the Orthodox majority church and state, and in all Soviet persecutions, they suffered greatly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with the evangelicals. They were all persecuted and locked up along with all the Orthodox Christians I know.
yeah.
So getting into, right, the 1940s and sort of the early
Mhm.
50s, we have the Nazi invasion of the USSR, obviously in 1941, and Stalin begins to allow some churches to reopen, sort of reviving official church leadership. Maybe, right, he permits election of Patriarch Sergius, as we just talked about earlier.
1943. Yeah.
Yeah, in 1943. Yeah, exactly. And he's sort of seeking, I think, patriotic support, right?
Yep. Exactly. That's how I see it too. So he
Mhm,
sought support, ideological support, and the 1943, if you remember, it's kind of we're about to get even with the Nazis. So
mhm,
the Nazis invaded in 1940, and it was very hard for the Soviet Union, and they were giving up territories and giving up cities. But in 1943 was almost like a breaking point. Now we're about to advance, and
mhm.
the war ended in 1945,
Yeah.
May
y-
9th, according to the Russian official
mhm.
historiography. And so, yeah, ideological support was much needed.
Yeah, the
But there is
19
a yeah. Go on.
yeah, I was gonna say 1945 is another, I think, kind of big year for the Orthodox Church, because Patriarch Alexei the First is elected. And some churches remain open, but the state
Mm.
still sort of controls the Russian Orthodox Church at this point, right?
Yeah, that was basically the way Stalin reopened, liberalized in like double quotation marks. Let's say he liberalized religion.
Mhm,
He basically allowed them to reopen, but under the almost total state control. And the Russian Orthodox Church was the first, but not the only one, because in 1944 it was the Baptists, and 1946 it was Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists. So Russian Orthodox Church was the first. Obviously, it's the dominant, it's the major religious organization and Christian church in Russia. So yeah, and the idea was obviously to control all this thing. So we probably cannot totally eliminate Orthodox Church, but we put it under the state control. And there were special departments founded, the Department for the Affairs of Religious Organizations and Cults, something like that. So it was two departments at some point. One was for the Orthodox Church specifically, and another one for anybody else. And then there were parts of the same department, but it's bureaucratical difference. And the important part is that the heads of this department were KGB personnel. So they were. It was not secret. They were not like agents. They were openly KGB personnel. They were wearing uniform. They are photographed in uniforms. They were like senior officers from the KGB. They were the heads of this department, and their main task was to negotiate things with the religious communities and also to control them through, for instance, all leadership could not be appointed or ordained. A bishop could not be ordained without a green light from the KGB. And the KGB had a great deal of influence into the candidates and who is elected, who is not, who is appointed to which region, and everything of that kind. So and hence all the rumors that basically there is another criticism nowadays, and since the 1990s at least, if not earlier, that the Russian Orthodox Church, the current Russian Orthodox Church, is a KGB project, and that all the key bishops were agents of the KGB. And for instance, the Patriarch Kirill had a code name Agent Mikhailov. We don't know whether it's true or not, because the KGB is still a secret. All the archives are still in secret. And the current KGB is called FSB. And at some point they were considering opening the archives, but they ended up not doing that. They just opened the individual cases for the families of victims, or for if the victim is survived, then for the victim themselves. So yeah, we will never probably know, not in our lifetime, whether these bishops were, but it was, I don't think it's that important. It's not important whether this or that important Soviet bishop was actually formally on a payroll of the KGB. He was controlled by them anyways, so why does it even matter? I don't see. I mean, he could have like somewhere a record that he is an agent with this code name, and this is the task that he's given. Or there may not be anything of that kind, but just the department for the relationships with the Orthodox Church just gave him, directly influenced him, said, you cannot appoint this bishop over there, but please appoint that bishop over there. And we insist on that. So it doesn't make a lot of difference whether there was a formal record and formal appointment, and maybe some monetary gain from that. Maybe he was given some money or not. It's not that important.
I mean, maybe the reason why they don't want to open the archives is because maybe a lot of the bishops are probably officially on the payroll there, and it's probably gonna stain. It's gonna be a stain on, on the Russian Orthodox Church. I think, because I don't think a lot of Orthodox Christians would be kind towards it, especially ROKOR, Russian Orthodoxy outside of Russia, which is, tends to be less patriotic, maybe. Terms of Russian.
With what we now know, there is so much compromising material that we don't even need anything additional. Like Alexei the First that you mentioned, it was the next patriarch after Sergius. Sergius died quite soon after his election, in a year, in probably less than a year. He died in 1944, and then Alexei the First was elected, and he was a patriarch until the 70s. I don't remember the exact year when he died. And he was the very loyal patriarch. He praised Stalin in all his public speeches, and he gave him a very beautiful eulogy when Stalin died. And there are lots of lots of just official photographs when he is presiding over something, when there is a huge portrait of Stalin behind him. So you don't really need much secret. I mean, the secret materials may shed light on something, like add detail, but we know the direction where the church went. The church was loyal. The church was obedient and put under control by the state. That we know for a fact, and we don't need very secret materials to testify to that.
Yeah, I think it's very clear in that era that the church is quote unquote compromised. It's right loyal to the regime. I don't think there's
again the leadership.
Yeah, the leadership is not like some. Obviously, that's the other interesting thing is, I mean, even now, for example, right, like, is that a lot of the leadership might be loyal to whatever the current government is, whether it was back then, whether it was Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, or now Putin. A lot of the priests are they think differently, right? They speak out against certain things the leadership
Not so
says.
many speak out, but the ones who do, they usually get punished. And how do they get punished? Someone reports on them. Because there are parish priests somewhere in a small town or some I don't know where, in the middle of nowhere. There is a parish priest. There are like a dozen or maybe a couple of dozens of congregants, and nobody knows what he preaches there, but someone may report on him for many reasons, for patriotic reasons, like ideological reasons, or maybe they just had a conflict and the person just doesn't like the priest. And they report to the bishop, to the regional bishop, and then they either suspended in ministry or defrocked totally, depending on the situation. But the another thing is we don't know. There are records of, like, say, there are periods when they report a number of defrocked or suspended clergy, and we can say that once in 3 months they report something like that to the Moscow Patriarchate, and we see the records that there is more than 100 of priests who are suspended or defrocked, but we don't know what for. Not necessarily for anti-war issues. They might be, caught with, drunkenness or something improper behavior, whatever we can think of, or who knows what for. The people may committed many other sins incompatible with being a priest. So we don't know exactly, but we know that the great marker for that is the special prayer that the Patriarch issued in the first several months of the war. He issued a several prayer to be mandatory during liturgy. And the prayer was initially for peace, but then they changed wording, and now it is for the victory of the Russian army, something like that. And it's just a marker, just the obedience marker. If you pray this prayer during the liturgy, then you're obedient, no problem. If you don't, then and get reported on that, of course, then you are suspended and maybe defrocked eventually. So
that's interesting. I know the prayer you're talking about here in ROKOR, Russian, here, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia here in the States. At least last time I went to ROKOR monastery, their prayer was the prayer for peace, for the land. We pray for the lands of Russia, Ukraine, and we pray for peace. So it's interesting that ROKOR sort of isn't buying fully into the Moscow Patriarch, although they're officially, I guess, under the Moscow Patriarch. But the event that recently happened with that priest that sort of called out Kirill on his nationalism. Do you know the event I'm talking about?
Yeah, you mean the one who asked him a question? Yeah.
Yes, and he kind of sort of got reprimanded.
There is an interesting context to that event. So there was basically the Patriarch of Moscow. He's also a bishop of Moscow. He's not just the Patriarch of the whole Russian Orthodox Church. He's also a bishop of Moscow. But next to Moscow, there is also this so-called Moskovskaya Oblast. That Moscow used to be a part of this oblast. So it was a region like Moscow and the area around it, the region of Moscow. Nowadays, those are two separate regions for many, many years back, even since the Soviet time. And he went for the first almost time in a long time to the bishops' conference, to the conference of the clergy of that region next to Moscow. Usually it was presided by one of his bishops, who was kind of not that he was not very liberal, but he was kind of not that strict. And it was more people were expressing their opinions like more freely or something of that kind. And at that time, Kirill decided to preside over this conference. And one of the priests, said he was talking about his usual stuff, the patriotism, like brotherly nations, and how it's important to support our people fighting against the gay pride parades and all this kind of ideological stuff that he usually talks about. And one of the priests asked him a question like, I don't think we as clergy should do patriotism. We should bring people to Christ and like deal with their ultimate salvation, but not with serving the country. And it's not just that it's open-minded priest. This priest belongs to a particular, I won't say ideology, but a particular school of thought within the Russian Orthodox Church that was sort of led by a very important priest that was killed exact time when Kirill was elected a patriarch. I keep forgetting his name. I'll look it up because it's a very important figure. Just a second. Daniil Sysoev. Yes, Daniil Sysoev was a priest in the early 2000s and mid 2000s. It was very notable, and he had this idea that we don't have citizenship on this earth; we have citizenship in the kingdom of heaven. There was a term for that which I don't slip my mind also. So he promoted this point of view actively, and Daniil Sysoev was also widely known as an active missionary. He evangelized online and also live to Muslims, especially. He converted many, many Muslims, and he was eventually killed by a Muslim fanatic in 2009 in his own church in Moscow. So this guy who asked Kirill a question was one of his students, I could say. He was taught by Daniil Sysoev. There is a context to that.
Yeah,
it's like a slightly more conservative wing to the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah, Daniil Sysoev. He's sort of long hair, glasses, right?
Yeah, they are all long hair, but glasses. You probably remember.
Yeah, he has work. Yeah, Daniil Sysoev. He's very well known. He was a beautiful soul. Yeah, converted a lot of Muslims. Yeah,
and he was eventually killed by a Muslim. Murdered in his own church. And the saddest part is about his family, but that's probably a long story. So his widow remarried one of his students also, but layman. And this layman, he sexually assaulted and harassed his daughters, Father Daniel's daughters, for many, many years. And they recently came out and spoke out about it and spoke up about it, and it's horrific. It's even worse than what happened to Father Daniel, because he was killed, but his family suffered even worse after his death. That's just a horrific story.
Yeah.
I have a video about it on my channel if you're interested.
Okay. Yeah, guys, go check that out. Yeah, Daniil Sysoev. I think a lot of you guys are familiar with him. I see him a lot in Orthodox circles. So go check out that video on Igor's channel. Pavel says, Val, Slavic world order. When? I don't know. Maybe soon we'll have Slavia will unite all the Slav. I don't know if that's ever going to happen.
Is it a question when we're going to discuss Ruski Mir, or is it a question about when the Slavic world is going to come?
What do you mean by Slavic order? Is it like a Slavic state controlled by a particular Slavic nation, or what is it? But thank you for the 100 monopoly money or Serbian money. I apologize. No disrespect to the Serbians. I love you guys. I love the Serbians. God bless you, Pavel. Let's see. Ivan here says Kurayev is most famous Russian preacher who is opposite to Patriarch Kirill.
Yeah,
Gundyayev.
Gundyayev is the family name of Kirill. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, Kurayev is a fascinating figure. Of course, I have a video about him. I don't even have to mention. Kurayev is most notable one online, and for the outsiders of the church. The outsiders of the church, they all know who Kurayev is because he was also quite influential online in 2000s. He had a blog, still he has the blog, but it's not as big as it used to be. When I don't know if you were aware, in 2010s and maybe earlier, yeah, 2000s and 2010s, the biggest blogging platform in Russia was livejournal.com. So one of my American friends laughed because they said it's like where 12-year-old girls write their diaries. But in Russia, it was the biggest blogging platform where all political blogs were and everything. And Kurayev was one of the key figures of the Russian Orthodox Church back then in the LiveJournal.com. And he is a deacon. He's just a deacon. He's not even a priest. He's never been ordained a priest because he's neither monastic nor married. So he was a deacon all his church career. He has been a deacon and still is. But he was a personal assistant to the previous patriarch, Alexei II, for some time. Not for the whole tenure, but for some time. And he knows a lot of inside info. He knows personally all the key bishops, including Kirill Gundyayev, including the current patriarch. And he went to the seminary with some of them. He knew them intimately with many others, so he knows all the things. And he became this accumulator of all the bad stuff, all the rotten stuff, the gay scandals, the pedophilic scandals, the corruption, everything. First, he started leaking everything himself, and then he became a hub of this dirty laundry, and everything is sent to him nowadays, and he shares it and comments on it. He is currently, these days, he's kind of very bitter. So when I read him, my impression is that he goes over the top because he's just very offended. And he was eventually, suspended in ministry, then defrocked by the patriarch, and then he left Russia, and then he became a foreign agent in Russia. If you know what that is, that's a status, that is the official stigma put on people who oppose the regime because he was clearly, openly anti-war. He now lives in Prague, but at the same time, he was reinstalled in ministry by the Constantinople Patriarch, and he is now an official cleric of the Lithuanian Metropolia, but he can still live in Prague because he is a missionary, so there is this complicated relationships. But he is most notable for people outside of the church. Of course, within the church, everybody knows him, but within the church, there are other important figures, but other important critics maybe of the church, but he is, like I said, notable for the outsiders and for online, especially online.
Yeah.
He gives interviews left and right, like almost every week, a couple of interviews.
He doesn't have a YouTube channel, does he?
I don't think so. No, he has a Telegram where he mostly reposts things from his LiveJournal, which he still holds. Very conservative approach, because who reads LiveJournal nowadays? It used to be a big thing. Like Navalny had a LiveJournal, all the ministers of the Russian state and some key figures within the church had. And Besoyev, I believe, had LiveJournal, but I'm not sure about that. So but he gives interviews in YouTube and everywhere. So you can see a lot
and you have a video about him on your channel, right?
Of course I do. Of course I do.
Interesting figure. All right, so going back to Orthodox in the Soviet Union, we get to, I think Stalin dies in 1953, right?
Yeah, March 5th.
Yes, Stalin dies March 5th, 1953. And we have the Khrushchev and Brezhnev sort of era of persecution. So I think it's like 1958 to maybe like 1964. Khrushchev launches like this new sort of anti-religious campaign. He
Yeah.
starts shutting down thousands of churches. Can you talk about Khrushchev's plan and kind of his version of persecution of the church?
Yeah, so unlike Stalin, Khrushchev is known for dismantling the personality cult of Stalin, like stopping the repressions, and even so his reign is known as something like a thaw. That is the official term for the THAW, thaw. So, and he's seen as a liberator, although kind of a freak because he had these freakish, crazy ideas about, I don't know, planting corn all over the Soviet Union, but corn doesn't grow everywhere in the Soviet Union. It doesn't grow in Siberia. Nevertheless, so he had these crazy ideas, but he was also very, like, he had progressive ideas. He launched the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. And he was very much about, dialogue with the West, although they had competition with the West. But he was almost like, had this gambling interest in competing and overtaking the United States. They won in space, they lost in some other, in moon program. So this is the public image. But at the same time, when it comes to religion, he decided that religion has nothing to do with our progressive state that goes to socialism, to communism, and religion is an obstacle. So he unfolded the anti-religious campaign. So unlike the Stalin's period, people were not directly just like, shot, executed, sent to gulags. There were no concentration camps anymore. But at the same time, his campaign was direct. It was directed against religious groups, and some of religious groups were especially hated, especially the underground ones, like underground Baptists or Pentecostals. They were like severely persecuted. They were considered perverted sects.
Yeah, sectante.
But also, say again?
I said sectante, I think is what they call them, right?
Yeah, but izuversky, so perverted sectarians, especially Pentecostals, because Pentecostals, they have speaking in tongues and stuff like that. So they were especially considered perverted and especially freakish. So yeah, and when it comes to even mainline like Orthodox Christianity, yeah, it was the ideological campaign showed that religion is for old people and for not that smart people, for people who are not well educated, like ignorant, maybe very rural, so they don't know better, and like old grannies. So the stereotype that most of the people in church are like babushkas, like grannies, old grannies in their head coverings, that was supported. And if someone like young and military age or very should be a productive member of society and is religious or attends church, that was shunned upon. And there was a picture, I don't want to waste time to find it, but it's in one of my videos, for instance, that Easter is the biggest holiday for Christians and including Orthodox Christians. So on Easter, there was special either KGB or police officers that were standing there next to the crowd and looking for any military-aged males to not attend Easter because they could have problems in the workplace, if they are members of the party especially, or if they are students or something. So in some pictures you can find that men with beards even have head covers like babushkas and trying to hide in the middle of this crowd just to attend the Easter service. I'm using it scary at the same time, and there were police officers and KGB officers that if they found someone that they could have problems. So I was saying, yeah, his campaign, the Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign, was not as brutal, obviously, as in the Stalinist time, but it was direct. That's the difference. Direct. It was aimed at. There is this citation that people say Khrushchev once said that he's going to show The Last Priest on the TV, but I've just recently learned that it's probably fake, that he either never said that or was never recorded. So it's something that people believe he said, but there was no evidence that he actually said something like that. But it goes well with the image of his anti-religious campaign because, yeah, we're going to eliminate religion, and we're going to show the last priest on the TV, and then it's going to be the last, and no more religion. But Khrushchev is now dead, and the Orthodox Church as well as other Christian churches are still there. So
his campaigns, anti-religious campaigns, were quite different from Stalin's purges. Was there resistance from the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church during this time? Was it a lot of forced submission, or was the church and the patriarch at this time, were they just kind of quote unquote puppets of the state?
When it comes to Alexei the First, who was the patriarch in that time, and he died during the Brezhnev's period already. So yeah, he was loyal. He was very loyal to Stalin, and he was very, very obedient to Stalin, and he praised him at every occasion. So he was, and most of the most important bishops were not that much controlled by Khrushchev himself and through the anti-religious campaign as through the department of the state relations with the church, because that's how they operated. And the church leadership, the state leadership didn't meet them that often. It was later during the Brezhnev's era, and especially Gorbachev, but so it was not a direct communication usually. They dealt a lot with other religious groups like evangelicals, who established a network of underground activities and dissident activities, but that's a different story. And they met with Mikoyan, for instance, but that's a different story. When it comes to their Orthodox Church, it was the leadership was mostly obedient.
Yeah. And then
I should say also that we said that it was not brutal as Stalinist campaign. It was not. What was it? It was propaganda and ideology. It was a system of, for instance, lectures and local societies and anti-religious clubs, anti-religious discussions, anti-religious events like an evening. Let's say we have a kolkhoz. In a kolkhoz, there is a club where something happens. There are gatherings, discussions, or music, or something like that, where they have like dance evening. And they also organized lectures when a lecturer from the local region, big city comes and reads a lecture on the how religion harms people, how religion harms communism and socialist society, and this causes destruction and everything like that. But as many historians can witness in their books, it was taken very formally. So people were not very enthusiastic about it, neither lecturers nor the audience. In most cases, there were, of course, exceptions. There were people who were very, very serious about that. But in most of the times, it was just one more. It's like, you have a meeting of your local Komsomol or party, whatever you belong to. You have the meeting here, meeting there, the work meeting, and the other meetings. And then you have some lecture. Someone lectures you about the religion, then someone else comes and lectures about your political, like geopolitical issues around the world, how evil the US is, and what's going on in Cuba, and then next day again against religion. So it was kind of very formally taken most of the time. But there was also lots of literature published, both fiction and non-fiction, and there were movies made. Anti-religious movies. Usually movies were about one particular community. Some movies were about the Orthodox Church. Some movies were about Greco-Catholics. There was a movie about Jehovah's Witnesses. There was a movie about Pentecostals. I think it's the best one is about Pentecostals, called Tuchi nad Borskom, or in English, Clouds over Borsk. Borsk is the name of a small fictional town. And it was just very well made. It's an old movie from the 60s, black and white, but the cast was tremendous. They were future stars of the Soviet cinema. It was very well made. Although it's a total, how do we put it, bollocks, but it was very well made and just good quality movie. So yeah, that was how they made the propaganda. But also, of course, local discrimination. So you cannot be baptized and be a party member if it's known, of course. I have a family anecdote about that. So I have a brother, an older brother, who is. We share the same mother. How do you call it? Step brother? No, if we
Half
have the
brother.
same mother. Half brother, yeah, half brother. So his grandmother, from his father's side, was very, very devoted Orthodox believer, and he wanted to get him baptized when he was born. But my mom was either becoming a party member or already a party member. I don't remember exactly, because I was not even born back then. He's older than me. And so she was against that, not because she was anti-religious particularly, but just it could ruin her career and make her life harder. Yeah, and she was not a believer. Yeah. So my grandma secretly baptized him when she was not at home. So she went back home, and her little toddler son plays with something, and he has a little cross on his neck. And she was like furious, because that would cause so much problems in the workplace. And he was probably, becoming a party member, already a party member. And she did not go into party for ideological reasons because she was like an Orthodox Bolshevik. No, she just need to progress in her career. That was in certain areas. If she was like, I don't know, a construction worker, it would not be needed. But she was working in academia all her life. And in academia, you could not progress to a certain position unless you're a party member, because it's an important ideological issue. So that's the story.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
So be baptized a believer, and at the same time, that's what your commenter says, something like that, right?
Well, let's see here. We have Ivan Gromky again. He says, if you were a member of the Communist Party, you can't be a religious person officially. But Kurayev said in some interview that in 1990s, many old communists started openly be a part of the Russian Orthodox Church.
You're absolutely right. And they are not now openly Orthodox because of conviction, most of them. They are just, the tides have turned. And nowadays, it's the trend is to be either religious or very, very, I don't know, like supportive of religion. It could be, there could be exception. If you're traditionally from a Muslim region, of course, you can be openly Muslim, because there are close to 20% of Muslims in Russia, less than 20, but close. So yeah. But other than that, many of the people in the power structures nowadays used to be Putin himself. He used to be a KGB officer. What does that mean? That meant that he was a party member, obviously, at that position, because he was a colonel. Maybe he could be a lieutenant without being a party member. I don't know the details, but a colonel, obviously, and everybody knows he was a party member. It's an open information. You can look it up. And it was out of the question. He could not be a religious person at all, or a believer. You could be a religious person and be an agent, undercover agent, but you could not be an official, formal, like officer personnel and be a religious person. That was out of the question. Although he claims nowadays that he's always been religious, he's always been an Orthodox Christian, and he said that he was probably baptized by the father of the current patriarch, and so on and so forth. But it's just a narrative which it's touching, but it's hardly verifiable. I don't actually buy it. And I don't think all of these people who are now like super Orthodox used to be believers at all in the before the 80s, mid 80s. They were probably atheists for the same reasons they are Orthodox today, for the reasons of the political climate, the state ideology, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there is a trend, and we can see all these people. They used to be Komsomol leaders, party activists, and ideologues in the communist times, and nowadays they are all sincere, genuine believers. Yeah, it's hard to believe. Some of them probably are. Some of them were converted in the 1990s or even earlier, when there was a resurgence, when there was a liberalization of religion, which culminated in 1988, when the millennium, the 1,000 years of Christianization of Rus was widely celebrated, and Gorbachev gave a green light because it was the middle of perestroika. And of course, it's a perfect example of how liberal we are now. our society, that we allow everything, and the freedom of religion. It was
Mhm.
widely celebrated.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my response to this comment,
Yeah,
which is absolutely right.
Ivan agrees with you. Okay,
Thank
and
you.
then so the Khrushchev era ends in around 1965. So 1965 to 1985, we have the Brezhnev era. Now there is still some, from what from my research, there's still some persecution
Mhm.
during the Brezhnev era. Obviously, the persecution is less violent, but it still is oppressive, and it still is very anti-religious. Uh, and the interesting thing, I think, the reason why the 1965 to 85 era is so interesting, um, because religious activity during this era is just pretty much like heavily monitored by the KGB, and that's why we get all
Mhm.
these theories, like all these current bishops, even Patriarch Kirill, they were all just KGB agents back in the day, and it comes from this sort of this there's Brezhnev. I mean, before even the Khrushchev era, but this Brezhnev era is less oppressive, but everything is monitored by the KGB.
That's probably why. But it also
Mhm,
depends on the community. We are now talking about the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, but the bright example would be Baptists, for instance, who split during the Khrushchev's campaign
mhm,
in 1961 into two groups. One refused to register and comply, went underground. Another agreed to comply and register, and was heavily monitored. So that was basically the example of what's going to happen if you go underground and you're harshly persecuted. And they were persecuted till mid-80s, till Gorbachev finally liberalized all this
mhm,
religious narrative. But they were persecuted even in early 80s. They were put in prison for long prison terms, and children were taken away from families, and the houses were demolished. If there was like a private house where the unregistered church service was held, they were bulldozed to the ground, and so on and so on and so forth. So that's what happens to those who refuse to comply. And those who agree to comply, they become the state-controlled, centralized, which for Baptists was against their principles.
mhm,
State centralization is against Baptist principles. But that was the compromise they had to comply, because that was the only way. You either play by our rules or like comply or goodbye, basically. And nowadays we still have two communities, and one positioned themselves as martyrs who suffered in the Soviet time, and another one they are sellouts. They obviously are traitors.
mhm.
They were controlled by the KGB, and still probably is. That's the narrative. That's not my
Mhm.
opinion. And
Yeah.
with the Orthodox Church, yeah, they probably went that way of state registration. But again and again, what do we mean by the church? If we talk about bishops and the leadership, yes. Were they formally KGB agents? We don't know, but they were definitely controlled by this department that was led by KGB officers officially. And definitely, yeah, and the church politics, the church leadership, the Moscow Patriarchate, and even the Patriarch for that matter, were controlled and heavily impacted. And they, even if I don't know what they sincerely believed, each and every one of them, but they didn't have the liberty and the freedom of movement. They had to comply. Otherwise, like, I don't know about Patriarch, but all other bishops could just be removed, put some other distant hierarchy, and
Mhm.
or just retire
Yeah.
forcibly. Something like that
Yeah.
that happened.
And does Alexei the first, does he die in around 1970, and then we have
Yeah,
uh
he died somewhere in the 70s. I don't remember the exact year. And then he was succeeded by Pimen.
mhm.
Pimen.
Okay, and then
And
Filaret.
Pimen ruled till 1990, when the year before the collapse of the
Yeah.
Soviet Union, he
Okay.
died and was succeeded by Alexei II.
Okay.
And that's
Yeah.
another era. That's already the new Russia.
Yeah, that's already New Russia. Yeah, so yeah. And then from 1985, 1991, obviously 91, the Soviet Union falls, but
Mhm.
during the Gorbachev era, right, we get to 1988. It's sort of the
Mhm.
millennium of Christianity in Rus, and
Mhm.
Gorbachev allows public celebration, sort of signaling a thaw that we mentioned earlier, right? A thaw.
Yeah, and there
So
were huge crowds of people, some out of curiosity, some eventually many converted. There were many converts to all religions, and new religious groups were founded. Some groups went from abroad, and some old already existing groups, they just had this huge influx of new converts and people interested. So there was a huge God seeking, because some just for mere curiosity. And we have many people in all religious communities, especially in Christian, who converted in that time, like late 80s, or those who were a bit later, maybe in the 90s, where eventually they found themselves in the country with a big Russian Orthodox presence. They kind of always knew that there is a church, and yeah, there are people who believe in God, yeah, and they go to church. They have candles there and icons, cross themselves. But then in the 1990s, there was they found themselves in a country with the dominating presence of the Russian Orthodox Church, and many, at least formally converted. Some just went to the church and got baptized. That's how my wife's family got baptized. They just, somewhere in mid-90s, she was a teenager, my future wife, and her parents, they just went to the church and got baptized.
Okay. Yeah,
and that's a very typical story, for the urban family in the 1990s.
Yeah, and then in 1990, Soviet law officially grants religious freedom, right?
Well, it was perestroika. It was a part of perestroika, because all the slogans that proclaimed Glasnost was basically the freedom of speech, and then the freedom of conscience, the freedom of everything, and the freedom of religion included. And 1988 was the how do I say the symbol of that, really. But also, let's say in the 1990, when Patriarch Pimen died, and there was the council was about to be called, the new council, the Bishops' Council, to elect a new patriarch. Then Filaret, who we already mentioned, who was one of the founders of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was back then of Moscow Patriarchate, he was one of the candidates to become the Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus. And he was very sure that he is going to be one. And having this old patterns, old habit, old memories, he went to the Politburo and he said, "Are you going to support me? Please support me, because I'm the most likely candidate, and I will probably win, and I need you." Yes, this is how things used to be done in the Soviet Union. He would go to the department, but department was abolished, so we went to Politburo. He had connections, and the functionary, like this particular leader, he came to, I believe it was Ryzhkov, but I'm not sure. Maybe someone else. Don't quote me on that. He said, no. It's your business now. We have nothing to do with that. It's your church. It's your internal affairs. Do whatever you like. We don't care. We practically don't care. And he lost that election. Maybe not because of the lack of support from Politburo, for other reasons, but he lost it to Alexei II.
Yeah. So that's an interesting time. So obviously 91, the Soviet Union collapses. There's a revival in Russian Orthodoxy, and I think you talked about this as well. This is where sort of I think this phrase resurfaces and becomes a thing of to be Russian means to be Orthodox.
I think it's much older. It goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, but it just got a new meaning. Well, this is a very problematic idea to connect the Russian ethnicity to the Russian Orthodox Christianity, because, as you probably know, probably your viewers know, Russia is one of the most multi-ethnic countries on earth. I don't know whether it's the most or not the most. Maybe India is the most multi-ethnic, but Russia is definitely top 5. And it's not like the US or Canada. It's not an immigrant nation in that meaning. It's just there are different sorts of people and ethnicities living in these lands that became Great Russia. And some of them are Muslim, some of them are pagan, some of them are Buddhist, some of them are not white, they are Asian, and so on and so forth. So it's a very multi-ethnic country. And, reducing Orthodox Christianity to Russianness would be a huge mistake, practically and historically and logically and theologically and whatever. And usually when they say Russian, that could mean different things again, because in the Russian language there are two different words for Russian. So Русский and Российский, again. One stands for ethnicity and culture and language and so on and so forth. Yeah, it could be Dostoevsky, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you have the exact quote and you can show it. So what I was saying, and you don't know exactly when they say Russian means Orthodox, do they refer to the Russian ethnicity, or do they refer to Russian as culturally Russian speaking, and so on and so forth? So it's a tricky thing. And again, there is the gospel that not the gospel, that the Apostle Paul, who says there is no Jew, no Greek, so
No Gentile,
basically, no Gentile. You cannot say that Russians are Orthodox and anybody else should not, or if you are Russian that you should be Orthodox necessarily. It's a tricky thing.
Yeah, a lot of times.
And it's a deep theological debates going back centuries about ethnophilitism, and you know much more about that than I do, because you are the theologian here.
This is it's an interesting. I think a lot of at least Westerners don't realize like how diverse Russia is. It's the Russian Federation today, and Russian identity today is much different than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Identity is constantly changing. It's usually pertaining to those time periods. So it's just the phrase. Usually, the intention of the phrase is like, you're Russian and something else, you're not Russian, and it's still, even to this day, right? We have, for example, a lot of, in like the MMA world, sports, right, mixed martial arts, we have a lot of representatives from Dagestan, coming from Russia, and it's like this fight. Are they Russian? Or are they not? They say,
but they're ethnically
Russian.
Not Russian, which is interesting.
Right? They're not, right? They're Caucasians from the Caucasus Mountains, like actually Caucasians, not the Enlightenment term Caucasian. So
Dagestan is a fascinating place because it has like almost like 50 ethnicities at least, and 50 different languages. And they use Russian as the lingua franca, so they speak to each other in Russian with a broken like accent, but it's fascinating. And there are lots of places like that across Russia, and it's very, very many of them are very devoted Muslims, very like practicing, like Khabib that you mentioned. He is known to be a conservative Muslim.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's Russian with an accent.
Yeah, they have their their funny accents. There's a lot of like comedy skits in Russia, imitating
very like racist ones.
Imitating
not racist. How do you put that?
Imitating this.
Xenophobic.
But I think it's like, right, we have Chechnya, Dagestan, Ossetia. There's so many regions. I think people need to realize that, because a lot of times, even when I interact with people, and let's say I'm talking about Dagestan, and I'm talking about like Habib or Islam, some of these guys they're like, oh, these Russian Muslims, and it's like, it's such a loaded term. Like, do you understand that ethnically, like they're not related to like people originally from Novgorod or Moskva or something? Like, it's totally different ethnicities. And now, like, right, the identity is sort of like, what does it even mean to be Russian? Like, they're just part of the Russian Federation. And a lot of people you even talk to, like a lot of like Chechensi, you talk to people from Chechnya, they won't even identify as Russian. They're like, no, I'm not Russian, right? I'm Chechen. I'm Chechen, because obviously there was conflicts with Chechnya and Russia. But yeah, it's a complex thing, I think, for sure.
And for some migrant communities, it's even worse. Like in the US, many people told me that they live with Latvians and Lithuanians, Estonians, Kazakhs, and they all considered Russians in the US or some other like Yeah, how do they know? Estonians? Who are those people?
Yeah.
What's that word? Yeah, they're just Russians, some kind of Russians, if they're from the
Mhm.
ex-Soviet Union, or even Polish people, for that matter, can be considered Russians because
Mhm.
it's somewhere next to Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of
Quite
ignorance.
offensive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a topic that sort of annoys me when they're like, "Oh, Ukraine, oh, Belarus, these are little Russians. Belarus,
Mm,
these are just Russians.
White
Moldova,
Russia.
throw 'em in there. People from Moldova are Russian. Everyone is Russian. These are just like Russian." It's like,
Mm.
no, it's not. Like these
That's what
divide.
happens when there was a huge empire that, although
Yeah.
it collapsed, but there is still yet another. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's the imperial stuff. Like, uh, I believe people still consider Irish or Welsh people as just
Mhm.
English, so kind of.
And they hate
How
that.
do I know?
Yeah, you
Same
tell a Welsh
thing.
yeah, you
Yeah,
tell a Welsh person he's English, it's gonna set him off.
I don't.
Um, yeah. Um, yeah, so you talked a little bit about Filaret. So he was supposed to be he thought he was going to be elected as a new patriarch after Tikhon, right, dies. But Alexei
Pimen.
Piven,
Yeah, after
sorry.
Pimen
Yeah,
died. Yeah.
and Alexei the second gets elected. And
Mhm.
what does Filaret do? So he essentially goes when does he start this Kiev Patriarch Church, this his own.
Oh, that's a long story. He is originally a Ukrainian from Ukraine.
Yeah.
I don't remember. He was born probably not in Kiev, but in some other place. But it doesn't matter. Yeah,
Mhm.
he was a bishop, a Kievan bishop, even before he had ambitions to become a patriarch.
Mhm.
So, and he held important positions. He was one of the most influential bishops. And by the way, when a bishop is ordained, there are several bishops who ordain him, not just
Yes.
one,
So
but
yeah,
there are
you mentioned
several.
that.
And he was one of the bishops who ordained Kirill, current
Mhm.
patriarch Kirill.
Yeah.
But they both, Kirill and Filaret, are like bishops ordained by Nikodim Rotov, one of the most important Soviet bishops. That's a
Mhm.
fascinating story, but I'm going astray. So Filaret, yes, when he lost the election to become a patriarch, he went to actively develop his metropolia back then, and he wanted to split from the Moscow Patriarch and basically had his own canonical Ukrainian church separate from Moscow. Autocephalous didn't succeed, but he gained a great deal of independence from Moscow. So it was basically, that a big deal. Basically, they formally they can manage their own affairs and even appoint their own metropolitan, but they need a blessing from Moscow.
Mhm.
So, by the way, we're now discussing with certain colleagues who are experts in the field what's going to happen when Onufri, the current head of the church,
Mhm.
I don't know, either dies or retires or something. And the new bishop obviously will be elected by the church, and obviously he will get no blessing from Moscow. So, what's going to
Mhm.
happen with the status of the church that is still claimed by Moscow? But that's a different
Yeah.
story, and that's hypothetical. But I think it's going to be a decisive moment in these relationships. So,
Mhm.
yeah, eventually, Filaret has a very hard personality,
Mhm.
very conflicting, and he used to be always involved in lots of intrigues and underground, not underground, like behind the curtain stuff.
Mhm.
So he eventually was replaced by Moscow for too much ambition to power. He was first uh, suspended and removed from the position of a metropolitan. Then eventually he was suspended in ministry, then defrocked by Moscow, so no longer a clergy, just a
Mhm.
simple monk. And eventually, when he persisted in his ambition, he didn't want to give up power, obviously, and eventually he was anathematized. So formally excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church. So he
Mhm.
quickly downgraded from the simple monk to
Yeah.
not a member of the church at all until he repents. which he probably won. Then he was involved in the creation of the church that is now OCU, I guess it is called, right?
Yeah, the OCU. Yep.
Yeah, and he was a leader of this church at some point. But again, with his greed for power and great ambition, and he was removed from the position. Then he established his own Patriarchate of Kiev. And he was briefly, this Patriarchate was recognized by some marginal churches somewhere, either in Bulgaria or in Romania. I don't exactly remember. A couple of other marginal churches, but then even they abandoned supporting and recognizing him. Nowadays, he is the leader of the unrecognized Orthodox Church, probably uncanonical by any measure, and it's called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarchate, something like that. He considers himself a patriarch. Finally, he became a patriarch of his own patriarchate, but it's quite a numerous church, and it was very instrumental in certain, I don't know, political events of the Orange Revolution of 2004 and Maidan Revolution 2013-14. And he was made the hero of Ukraine officially by President Zelensky, if I remember correctly, in 2019.
Yep.
So he's a significant figure, and he's quite old nowadays, 96-ish, something like that, and still active.
Yeah, he's an old man in his 90s and still causing schisms in the church. He essentially... he essentially abandoned the OCU, the Pravoslavная Церковь Ukraine. He essentially abandoned them, which was like his original project. And then he became his own. I don't actually know the reason for that. Why is, I think maybe he didn't want.
Yeah, when I made a video about him, I went into this rabbit hole, but I just don't remember all the details nowadays, the exact details. But his biography is relevant in the context of our today's topic in the Soviet time, because he's one of those bishops, along with Kirill and many others, ordained by Nikodem Murotov, and Nikodem Murotov himself, the Soviet bishops. If you look at their biographies, they're quite notable. So you know that bishops are formally monks. They give vows, monastic vows, and they formally need to go through certain stages. You cannot just become a bishop. You need to become a monk first, obviously. You have to be ordained as a priest, as a deacon first, then as a priest, then at some point as a monk. And if you look at the biographies of all these people, all these important key bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, including Filaret, who used to be a key bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church, one of the most important ones, maybe after the Patriarch, in top 5 definitely. And you can see that they kind of skim through all these stages. They become ordained as a monk, and several days they become a deacon, then in several days a priest, then maybe archimandrite, which is the highest position of monastic priesthood before a bishop. So they made it through all the things, and even if they stay for some time, for instance, they graduate from seminary. In several years, they become the hegumen, which is like the head of the monastery. People can be monks for decades and don't become a hegumen, right? And they just made a hegumen at some point. So there is something in there, some kind of an important connection that goes on in the seminary usually, because they all progress, like skyrocket their careers in the seminary. And Kirill, current Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus, Patriarch Kirill graduated from the seminary. And in 4 years after graduating, he became a rector of that seminary. So it is something going on there. Like Kurayev would tell you that they're all homosexuals, and it's all through homosexual relations for monks. But I don't think it's that simple. Maybe for some of them, I don't know. But there should be something else. So they kind of establish some important connections. They have protection from some important bishop, and this important bishop needs his people. So you see what I'm saying? It's kind of not exactly maybe mafia, but something of a kind of a political structure. That's why I refer to the leadership of the church separately from the church as the whole. So it's a different story. And some of these bishops, there were bishops who, I don't know, were serving as parish priests for some, like Alexei II, the previous patriarch. He was a parish priest for some considerable time. He was even married, but then his local bishop authorized his divorce because they considered it's not for him. He was made for the church ministry and so on and so forth. Again, very shady story. There was a version that they just wanted him not to go to the army, and if you're a priest, you were exempt from the army, and you become a priest either being married or being a monk. And so there was this long story, but who knows? But he was married. There is a picture of him with his wife, and he was a parish priest for some time with his wife as his wife of a priest. So yeah, you see, these bishops are a very interesting case. Very interesting how they progress through all the stages where people can spend in all of these steps. They can spend decades of their life serving as a deacon, as a parish priest, being then progressing to, I don't know, like a hegumen, a head of the monastery. How can you become a head of something when you never lived in this monastery? You've never been a simple monk. You're a monk for like, I don't know, a month.
Yeah.
And you know nothing about monastic life, but you're just appointed to be a hegumen. And so on and so forth. So it's kind of something is going on there.
Yeah, it's definitely suspect, and I do get a lot of criticism, especially on X, when I will go on rants about these things, and I just get attacked from left and right by people. But I do want to, as Igor underline, and I want to underline that the church isn't just the leadership. Like we see just throughout church history, throughout Christian history, we see a lot of corruption in the leadership, right? It's evident even to this day, right? We can look at the leadership and there's suspect stuff going on. The church is more than that, right? The church is the body of believers where Christ is the head and we are the body. So I don't want people, because a lot of times we get criticism in apologetic circles when I'll have debates with Roman Catholics or something. A lot of times the criticism will be, well, look at this patriarch did this and that if I criticize the Pope, which is sort of a false comparison, a fallacy in the sense of like, we don't have the same ecclesiology as the Roman Catholics do. And this isn't something that should encourage or discourage people from saying, oh man, like, wow, orthodoxy really is, the leadership is doing this, orthodoxy is a mess or something. No, this is, it's the church isn't just the leadership. And I think if anything, I think it should sober people up and make them realize that, maybe because a lot of, especially here in the West, a lot of people just, engage in these political debates and they sort of like all in on supporting this patriarch and all this and this. They're pretty much become like their jurisdiction, their diocese, of the Russian Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, or Greek Orthodox, like that becomes their identity as Russian Orthodox. They might not be ethnically Russian, but I'm Russian Orthodox. Everything Russian Orthodoxy related, I stand by. That's my tribe. That's my new identity now. And I think you just need to lay off that and realize that no, you're an Orthodox Christian. Yeah, you're under a certain jurisdiction and you belong to this diocese in the West, but just realize that you're first and foremost, you're an Orthodox Christian. So sort of it can get complicated when it comes to ecclesiology and leadership. But you touched a lot on this, and this is sort of something that, if you have any final thoughts, we're already at almost 2 hours, so I just want to close with this question, and you just pretty much touched on it. So does the church truly become free after 1991, or do we still sort of see this lingering influence, whatever you want to call it, from the Soviet era, stuff that's just still lingering in whatever the post-Soviet Orthodox churches? Like, do we still see the lingering effects or influence, or these people that were maybe agents, whatever you want to call them, at one point, and it still has sort of this lingering effect and influence on the leadership or orthodoxy as a whole in post-Soviet, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, maybe?
This is such a complex question. It depends on how do we even perceive what's going on in today's Russia. How do we see the today's Russia? Is it the Soviet Union 2.0, or is it something different? So if we just again judge by the leadership and what they say publicly, Putin expressed his sorrows about the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he definitely wants to position himself and his regime as the new edition of the Soviet Union. In that sense, of course, it's similar. But also, when we talk about the relationships between the state and the church, it was never the same. It was always changing and fluctuating throughout the Soviet regime. People say, like, okay, there is the Soviet regime. In the Soviet regime, the church was persecuted. As we just discussed, it was different. It was not like fully supported, just like it is today. The president, the leader of the state, was never considered a Christian and went to the church and crossed himself publicly. It was never the case, of course. But even sometimes it was tolerated, sometimes it was persecuted, sometimes it was used in something useful for the state. Like Nicodim Rotov that I mentioned was the church diplomat, and through his diplomacy, the Soviet state tried to establish relationships to the Holy See in Vatican. So basically, again, to build a new bridge of the Soviet diplomacy. Of course, they were not interested in the church, the Catholic Church per se, but there was a bridge to the Western world, just another channel, very useful, very, very promising channel of diplomatic communication with the West, which failed eventually. That project did not work out. And if you know the biography of Nicodim Rotov, he died in the presence of the Pope, and the Pope read prayers to him while he was dying of a heart attack. That's a very interesting story, and there were lots of conspiracies about that. So yeah, and nowadays, what's going on nowadays? Nowadays, if you watch the Russian television, you see a harmony, almost like symphonia, that was strived for by the Orthodox Church centuries before. Almost like we have the Orthodox president who has the Orthodox patriarch as his right hand, almost like our spiritual advisor of sorts, which is very far from the truth. My impression is that the state uses the church, obviously, for the ideological support, and at the same time, they don't want the church to have too much power, too much influence in the spheres other than that are assigned to them. So obviously, you dominate the religious sphere, no problems, but make some concessions to Islam, because Islam is just too powerful, too influential, and in certain cases, like Chechen Republic, too problematic. So make concessions to Islam, but generally you dominate all other religious sphere in the country. And at the same time, okay, you also take care of the morals, family values, traditional conservative morals, but again, with certain limitations, because they still cannot totally lobby the anti-abortion law. They have tried for decades, but the anti-abortion laws still, they haven't succeeded. They put some limitations here and there, especially after the start of the war, when the conservative values are on the rise, but they just cannot, because it's too problematic. Russia is still, it's not the world leader abortions, I believe, nowadays, or maybe it still is, but it's definitely top 5. And it's a Soviet Union. In the 1990s, we were definitely number 1. Nowadays, it's somewhere, I'm not sure, maybe still number 1, maybe top 5, not sure. Don't quote me on that, but still there. Divorce, abortions, homeless children, orphans, and social orphans, where parents are still alive, but custody is taken away. All these issues are still there. It's still world leader in many of these issues. So you see, and they have limitations in influence. They still cannot. They are managed to probably they celebrated as their victory the anti-LGBT legislation.
Mm.
But I don't think it's the church that succeeded in promoting the anti-LGBT legislation. It was probably the anti-West rhetoric, because the West is associated with LGBT.
Mm.
So basically you have the gay pride parade all there, and parent number one, parent number two, which is sometimes it's even true, as we know nowadays. And so which gives them the opportunity to talk about these things. But you see, so the church is quite limited. That my major point is the church is quite, and in no way they have significant influence and impact in foreign policy, including the war in Ukraine. It's all fiction. It is fake. It is an image on the screen. Like the patriarch has a say in that war. It was quite evident when the war just started. I mean that part in 2022, because some people insist that the war started in 2014, but do not go there. The active invasion started in 2022, the military invasion. And it was quite obvious that the patriarch was not aware, that he was not informed, he was not briefed, he was not, consulted with. He didn't know what to say. He had to make some public speeches, sermons, and addresses, but he was lost. He didn't know what to say. It was something very generic until he made up his mind, or maybe consulted with someone, or maybe made up his mind himself. Who knows? But then eventually he developed the line and the narrative, and nowadays he has the narrative, and we'll heard it. But in the first days, it was obviously he didn't know what to say. So that testifies to the fact that his impact and influence is quite limited in the political sphere, especially foreign policy. And foreign policy was always kind of terra incognita for the church. In the Soviet time, when they were used they were sent to special congresses and meetings and to Vatican to establish relationships, like this example. But since then, they had very limited influence on foreign policy, if any. That's one of my final rant.
And you mentioned that a lot of married clergy sort of is in opposition to Patriarch Kirill.
That's not the exact. I would turn it upside down. So it's not exactly accurate statement. It's not that the married clergy revolts against bishops. It's probably only amongst the married clergy we have dissidents. Never amongst bishops, almost never. There were dissidents amongst bishops, including Filaret, for instance, or other people. They were rebelling on for different reasons. Like Filaret was thirsty for power, and like Diomede was a bishop in Chukotka. He had crazy conspiracy ideas of his own. He was just like a very fundamentalist radical. So it was a different case. But most of the time, the bishops, the leadership, are the obedient part. They maybe they have some issues, but we never know, because it's always behind the curtain. So sometimes Kirill replaces, or Alexei before him, replaces some bishops. He takes one away and puts another one, and we don't know the reasons for that. Kuraev knows some reasons, and some insiders know, and there are rumors, but they're never verified. So Kuraev may say whatever he says. Maybe he has good reasons to say so, but we don't know. And there are scandals, like with this metropolitan. Just slipped my mind. Ilarion, or Hilarion, like he's spelled in different languages. So he was involved in a homosexual scandal with his assistants, and he was the most important church diplomat. He was the head of the Department for Foreign Relations, but then he was removed from that position in 2022. Nobody knows why. Some said maybe he was against the war, but it's highly unlikely. Then he was sent to Budapest to head the small eparchy there, and then he got involved with the scandal, but he also got involved in financial scandals. So there were lots of financial streams that went to his actives, but not to without knowledge of the patriarch and the church leadership, and that's why he was removed from there when he was put somewhere else. But Kuraev and others say that he knows too much. That's why he was not punished too severely. He was just retired, as far as I remember, but not defrocked, not suspended, because he probably possesses some information that is discriminating for the church leadership. So we have rumors and guesses. Maybe it's all a lie. Who knows?
Yeah.
We can only guess. Sometimes bishops get removed. Sometimes other bishops put on their place. And when it comes to priests, the only dissidents, open dissidents who speak up against the church, we know are married priests. And it's been the case for centuries. There is some kind of a covert conflict between bishops who accumulate power and priests, especially married priests, who serve in their ministries in local parishes, who work with the faithful, not work, who serve the faithful.
Yeah.
That would be the right word, yeah. Who have direct communication and contact with the faithful, with lay people, and bishops who are the leadership. And this conflict was one of the instrumental in the schism of the 17th century. If you remember, the old believers, all the rebels were married priests, like protopopi, which is the old word for what is now protoierei, or archpriest, I think it's in English, if I remember correctly. So it's the highest position of a married priest, not just a priest, but the highest priest. So, and all the people who go against the church, with Kuraev is an exception as a deacon, because he's just too influential, and he is just a deacon because he moved himself not in a formal hierarchy, but just in informal online, and he became famous and well known and outspoken. But he's just an exceptional figure with huge influence, but the lowest status in church hierarchy. Most of others are priests, married priests, and some of them emigrated abroad. Some of them live in different countries, and the Constantinople Patriarchate usually restores them in ministry. And when it comes to canonicity, I have no idea how to approach that, whether it's canonical or not. It's definitely not my cup of coffee. And and that's the case. So most of the priests are obedient or silent, which is a form of obedience, I guess. But the only dissidents we know are priests, married priests, with the only exception, Kuraev, Deacon Kuraev.
Yeah, he's a very outspoken sort of whatever you want to call it, infamous, famous figure. And I mean, and you see that in other dioceses as well. I mean, you see that in other jurisdictions. Although I would say a lot of these priests are still obedient to their metropolitans, their bishops, then eventually the bishops are obedient to their patriarch. But a lot of especially because of the online world, to where orthodoxy is garnering a lot of followers now through the online world, a lot of these online figures who have quite large followings are just priests, and some are just deacons like Kuraev. But a lot of them are priests, and we're starting to see this. I mean, you're probably not familiar maybe with this online world, but we can't. I mean, we just recently had people know a guy named Father Moses, who put out some videos
from Texas, right?
Yeah, and he got reprimanded by his bishop for the video, saying it's not becoming of a of a priest to do that. And then even I went and stayed at quite a famous abbot's monastery, Father Trifon, who I think a lot of people know. We call him Grandpa. Another guy who is constantly, who's part of ROKO, Russian Orthodox Church outside of is constantly getting in trouble with his leadership for certain things he says, certain things he does, like dressing. He told a funny story of him dressing up as Santa Claus and going to the kids and doing a thing. And he had his mother come and sit on his lap for a picture. And this picture was published all over the newspapers, and the leadership got a hold of it and said, this is not becoming of a monastic to have a woman's, and this is my mother sitting on my lap. But it became a whole, so it's it's constant these battles between, or butting heads, I guess you should call it.
Yeah, and the outsiders usually have no clue what's going on because they judge by different standards. Because I've heard many criticism, why are you staying in this church if you disagree with what the patriarch says? Just go to another church. And it's not like you're changing the club or something, right? It's not like you just, I don't like this apartment, let me move to another apartment. Okay, I'll spend some money and time and everything, but it's just an apartment. No, it's the body of Christ, right? It's the church that gives you holy sacraments. How can you just change it?
Yeah,
it's a big deal. Sometimes it's even unthinkable. Let's say you live in a family and your father drinks alcohol and beats up your mother. So you're just, okay, I'll go to another family. Is it that easy? Or is it, after all, maybe most important decision of your life, or one of the... So outsiders just don't understand what's going on. So why are you still there? Just change it.
Yeah, it's
even
not,
even the country is not that easy to change, even just mentally. To not say about logistics, but just, okay, I don't like this country, I go live in another one. For some people, it's just, that's my country. Why should I? Not my case, because I'm an immigrant. But in other cases, it's just, why? How can I change my family, my church, my country?
It's not that simple. And I think maybe, it's probably very simple in sort of the evangelical world, the Protestant world.
No,
maybe.
not exactly. No, it depends. It depends.
Okay. Because I know, like, here in the sort of, low church evangelicalism, people, will have a disagreement with the pastor, they'll leave, go to another church, and people kind of switch churches quite frequently, just growing up here, knowing a lot of and we have a large diasporas of Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian evangelicals here that, obviously growing up as a Ukrainian, I have interactions with, you connect on, these are people from your, from, they speak your language. So I see, so I see that quite a bit with them. And there are reasons for, I know there was I don't know if you're familiar. I mean, there was in the Orthodox world, there was a 1990 agreement between the Syriac Church. It was this agreement to allow certain jurisdictions to commune Oriental Orthodox people. And they still do this to this day, and it's kind of a big controversy. For example, the Antiochian Diocese in the UK allows Coptics and Syriacs and, other Orientals to partake of the Eucharist, which is, they're in schism. They wouldn't be allowed anywhere else. And many people side this agreement. And if laymen or priests sort of speak out against that under this diocese, they get defrauded, they get excommunicated. But that's a whole other issue. I think if it's something as big as this issue of, like, maybe communing schismatics, even then, what do? You grow up in the Antiochian church, the patriarch starts to allow, communion of, schismatics. This is your family. Like you just gave that example. Like, what? It's not as simple as just leaving your family. But we have a question here from Charlie. I'll address just some comments here, and then we'll probably close. From Charlie Lazarovich says, what happened to the old believers during the communist period?
Well, all sorts of things, just like any other religious communities, but many of them emigrated, but some quite unsuccessfully, to the places that became Soviet Union, like Estonia. Estonia has a large old believer presence, and they became in 1940 they became a part of the Soviet Union. So they were discriminated against, and again, it depends on the community of old believers, because some lived an urban life and some lived in isolation as much as possible, and refusing all modern comforts, like refusing electricity. Some do, some don't. It depends. You can take different communities and they have different degrees of isolation. Some just live distantly but have no problems communicating with others, and some live distantly and don't want to have anything to do with the civilization. Like some use electricity but don't use internet. Some use everything. Some. So again, this is a big umbrella. So what happened to them depended on how they lived, basically, because the Soviet ideologues and like police officers, for instance, and KGB officers, they didn't want to go too much into details on their theological differences. So if they lived an anti-social or anti-societal, anti-communist life, then they were persecuted. And again, depended on the. So it's hard to say, because all believer is not a community; it's a conglomerate of communities. It's an umbrella of communities. So there is no like simple answer.
And somebody says,
that's exactly what
group. Yeah, exactly. We talked about that. There's a bunch of different groups within them.
Some have priesthood, some don't. Because they don't have priesthood, not because they don't believe in priesthood. They just believe that the apostolic succession ended. Maybe with Niconian reforms, maybe at some other point, but just there is no legitimate bishop who could ordain a legitimate priest. So that's why they don't have priests. They, of course, all believe in priesthood, but they just something it interrupted and ended.
Yeah, to this day, I mean, the community that I know, they live together, but there's constant butting of heads and between the non-priest ones and the priest ones, and then within their communities,
not only,
and within their communities, some of them leave and they get chrismated into the old rite that is canonical in communion with the Russian Orthodox Church. So it creates like these three communities within their one old rite community of canonical old rite, priest old rite, non-canonical, and non-priest non-canonical old rite. So their communities are, even to this day, they're like second, third generation Russians at this point. They're still very unique. I mean, and just they're different. They're sort of, to this day, I would say, they're quite isolated from the rest of society.
Yeah, some of them live an urban life, and they might be your neighbors, and you don't recognize them. Like my neighbors, I live an urban life. You probably you mentioned you're not. So they might be my next door neighbors, and I would never know. So it depends again on what kind of community they belong to. Different concords or soglasiya in Russian. So different groups, churches. Some have churches. Some live in Romania for many years, and they complain that they're losing the knowledge of the Russian language and the ability to read the Old Church Slavonic Bible, because their Bibles are in Old Church Slavonic. They are not in the modern Russian.
They still do that in the Old Church.
Yeah, all over the world, Estonia, Colombia, the US, Canada, whatever you can think of.
Yeah. I mean, I'm impressed to this day that they're able to, even being so many generations removed from Russia, they're still able to do liturgy full Old Church Slavonic. They educate all their kids in Old Church Slavonic.
Because that's the only Bible they recognize.
Yeah, and their communities tend to be very anti-English speaking, which is inevitable because their kids eventually have to interact with the rest of society, end up speaking English anyways, but they try to like preserve this like purity. So interesting group.
There was a Romanian group I watched a documentary on that was made by one of my former professors, and they complained that their children are losing Russian, and they themselves already are bilingual, Romanian and Russian, and their children, they say, like, we have in all our community, we have like two maybe people who are able to read the Bible in Old Church Slavonic, and one of them is like very old and sick. And so, we're losing that. And the priest comes and he is not that fluent in Russian. He mostly speaks Romanian to us and so on and so forth. So different kind of problems. But the interesting thing is that they are much more Russian than the Russian Orthodox Church, because the Russian Orthodox Church does not discriminate by ethnicity. There are priests, bishops, clergymen, and laymen, especially, of all ethnicities you can think of. Whoever is welcome. But when it comes to the old believers, they are almost predominantly ethnic Russians and Russian speakers.
They're very ethnocentric individuals. All right, guys, we're coming up on like 2 hours and a half. I think it's been a very interesting stream. sort of going through the history of Orthodoxy during the Soviet Union, and then obviously we went down some rabbit holes. The anti-God Soviet regime corrupted the official Russian Orthodox Church, Sergianism.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
Sergianism. That's one of the opinions that we mentioned.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. We talked
it's
about
still
that. Yeah.
alive today, this opinion, and you have
Mhm.
reasons to think so. Yes, unfortunately.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you guys for joining us. You guys can find Understanding Russian Orthodox. I have all of Igor's links down in the description to his YouTube channel. I don't know if Igor wants people following his X or anything else. And then also I have a link to his book, Understanding Russian Christianity. It's on Amazon. So is there anything that you want to shout out? Anything you want to say, Igor, to close
No,
it
just
out?
YouTube. But I have like a marginal X, which I use for technical things. But please, if you're interested, subscribe to my YouTube, and that's pretty much the only place I'm active.
Yep. All right.
Don't have
Awesome.
Facebook,
Thanks a lot,
don't have
guys.
nothing. Thank you for
thanks a lot,
having me.
guys.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, yeah, of course. And thank you, Igor. And I'll see all you guys later.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, comment, and subscribe for more. And follow my social medias in the description below. I'll see you next time. God bless.